A 22-year-old American climbs out of the ground into the cold. He has spent the night underground, in a meat locker beneath a slaughterhouse, while the city above him burned. Now it is morning and the city is gone. Dresden, a city 12 centuries old, one of the most beautiful in Europe, has been turned into a flat plain of ash and standing chimneys. The streets are still too hot to walk on. The bodies are everywhere, and they don't look like bodies anymore. That young man's name was Kurt Vonnegut, and it would take him 23 years to write down what he saw that morning. This is not a book review. This is the story of how a man tried and failed and tried again for 2 decades to put one unspeakable thing into words, and how, when he finally did, he had to invent aliens and time travel to do it. Because the truth could not be told in a straight line. The numbers are the easy part. On the night of February 13th, 1945, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries on Dresden. The high explosives blew the roofs off. The incendiaries set the interiors alight. And then the fires merged into a single mass, a firestorm, a self-feeding column of flames so hot it generated its own hurricane-force winds, pulling in air, pulling in oxygen, pulling in people. Vonnegut was there as a prisoner of war. He'd been captured at the Battle of the Bulge weeks earlier, marched across Germany, and packed into Dresden with other American POWs. Their barracks was a converted slaughterhouse. The Germans had a number for it. In German, it was Schlachthof-funf. Slaughterhouse-Five. When the bombing started, the prisoners and their guards were herded down into an underground meat locker, a cellar built to keep animal carcasses cold, 2 stories below the street. The thick stone and the cold air saved them. Above them, the city they could not see was becoming a furnace. The temperature on the surface climbed high enough to melt glass and ignite asphalt. When they finally came up the next day, their job was to dig the dead out of the cellars where they had suffocated. Vonnegut later called it a corpse mine. That cellar, Slaughterhouse-Five, is the only reason Kurt Vonnegut lived to write anything at all. But surviving was just the beginning of the problem. Here is the first thing most people don't know. Vonnegut did not come home and write a war novel. He came home and tried to, and for 23 years, he could not. He had the most important story of his generation sitting inside him. He'd seen something almost no other American writer had witnessed firsthand. And every time he sat down to write it, it came out wrong. Flat. Small. He filled wastebaskets. He told friends the book was finished, then admitted it wasn't, then started over. The problem was structural, and it was honest. A war story has a shape. It has heroes and villains, a beginning and a climax and a meaning. But Dresden had no meaning. There was no lesson in it, no redemption, no point at which the suffering paid off into something noble. It was just a city, and then it was just ash. How do you give a narrative arc to something that is, at its core, a void? For 23 years, the most truthful thing Vonnegut could say about Dresden was nothing. So, what finally broke the silence? What broke it was the decision to stop pretending the story made sense. The book Vonnegut finally published in 1969 follows a man named Billy Pilgrim. And Billy, in the very first pages, becomes unstuck in time. He doesn't experience his life from beginning to end. He bounces childhood, war, old age, his own death, all out of order, with no warning, no control. One moment he's a prisoner in Dresden. The next he's an optometrist in 1960s America. The next he's been kidnapped by aliens. Readers have spent decades arguing about whether the aliens are real or whether Billy is simply broken, whether the time travel is science fiction or the symptom of a mind that survived something it could not hold. And that argument is the whole point. Because this is what trauma actually does. It refuses chronology. A survivor doesn't remember the worst night of his life in order, like a story. He gets ambushed by it, a smell, a sound, and suddenly he is back there, fully, with no transition. Billy Pilgrim's Unstuck in Time is not a gimmick. It is the most accurate description of post-traumatic memory ever put into fiction. Vonnegut couldn't write the trauma in a straight line because trauma does not happen in a straight line. The aliens, the time jumps, the flying saucers, they aren't decoration. They are the only containers strong enough to hold a thing that has no narrative shape. But there's one more layer most readers walk right past. The aliens give Billy a philosophy. They're called the Tralfamadorians, and they see all of time at once. Past, present, and future, all equally real, all unchangeable. When someone dies, they simply say, "So it goes." And in the book, every single death, a war, a glass of flat champagne, millions of people, gets the same 3 words. So it goes. It sounds like comfort. It sounds like peace. Make your peace, accept that everything already happened, you can't change it anyway. And here is the trap. That philosophy is not Vonnegut's answer. It is the lie that lets you survive, and the lie he is warning you against. So it goes is what you tell yourself so you can keep breathing while a city burns. It is the surrender of a man who has decided that resistance is pointless because the slaughter is already woven into time. Vonnegut hands you that comfort precisely so you can feel how poisonous it is. A book that truly believed So It Goes would not have needed 23 years to write. He wrote it because he refused to accept it. That tension between numbness and grief, between accepting horror and screaming at it, is the engine of the entire novel. And it's exactly why, decades later, people tried to ban it. This is the third thing most people don't know, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Slaughterhouse-Five became one of the most frequently banned and challenged books in America. School boards pulled it off shelves. In 1973, a school in North Dakota didn't just remove copies, it burned them in the school furnace. The objections were always the same: the language, the sex, the irreverence, the refusal to treat war as glorious. In 1975, a school board on Long Island, New York, ordered Slaughterhouse-Five and several other titles removed from school libraries, calling them anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. A group of students sued. The case, Island Tree School District versus Pico, climbed all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1982, the court ruled, in a landmark decision, that school officials cannot remove books from library shelves simply because they dislike the ideas inside them. A student's right to receive information was held to be protected by the First Amendment. Think about that. A book born in an underground meat locker, written to describe a massacre, became the legal battleground for whether American students have the constitutional right to read challenging ideas at all. The firestorm that Vonnegut survived in 1945 was still throwing off heat in an American courtroom 37 years later. But to understand why it terrified people so much, you have to understand what the book was really arguing. Vonnegut was not anti-war in the simple, sloganeering sense. He knew that telling people not to have wars was, in his own words, about as useful as telling them not to have glaciers. His target was narrower and sharper. It was the story we tell about war, the clean, heroic, meaningful version. The version with a moral. Vonnegut had stood in the actual ash of the actual city, and he knew that version was a lie. So he gave his book a subtitle almost nobody remembers: The Children's Crusade. Because the soldiers weren't grizzled heroes. They were boys. Children, sent to die and to kill, dressed up afterward by survivors and politicians as something grand. That is the real radicalism of Slaughterhouse-Five. It refuses to let the massacre mean something. It refuses to convert dead children into a noble sacrifice. And a culture that needs its wars to be noble finds that refusal unbearable, unbearable enough to pull the book from shelves, unbearable enough to feed it into a furnace. Vonnegut took the most chaotic, formless, unspeakable experience a human being can have, and instead of forcing it into a comforting shape, he built a book honest enough to stay broken. That is why it survived. That is why it's still banned. And that is why, more than 50 years later, it still works. If this changed how you think about Slaughterhouse-Five, or about what a book is even capable of carrying, subscribe right now. Every week we break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time, the way you were never taught in school. And if these 10 minutes were worth your time, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story deserves to be heard, and it helps this channel more than you'd think. So it goes. But this story, we're not letting disappear.